Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. We are now entering the full swing of this election. And how scared are you? You know, you're not scared enough, but you need to be. And you need to listen to this episode of the podcast with my guest, Rick Hasen, who's the author of a new book called Election Meltdown. There are people who are afraid that President Trump will be reelected. There are many people concerned that he won't be reelected. But in this conversation, you'll come to see that there are some other things that we ought to be very concerned about, and they go to the foundation of our democratic process itself, the integrity of our vote. When it comes to voter suppression, voter fraud, when it comes to dirty tricks, when it comes to the threats of cyber hacking, when it comes to the rhetoric coming from both Democrats and Republicans, questioning, doubting the integrity of our system, we ought all to be very concerned. And my guest, Rick Hasen, has a lot to say about that. You'll want to listen to this episode and share it with your friends. I hope you do. Stay tuned. The first votes are about to be cast in contests in Iowa and New Hampshire, and then we are really in the full swing of the primary election season leading up to the very important elections in November of this year, the 2020 presidential and congressional elections. And we are consequently hearing more and more about the validity, the integrity of our election system, everything from allegations of voter misconduct, never well backed up, by the way, all the way to new concerns about hacking from foreign powers, including Russia. So to address these issues as we enter the fullest of the full swing of this election season is my guest, Rick Hasen. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Rick?
It's actually Hasen.
Hasen, okay. Rick is a professor of law and political science at the University of California in Irvine. He is an expert in voting law and voting practices. He's been named one of the top 100 most influential lawyers in America, and he's the author of a new book called Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. So, Rick, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
It's great to be with you.
This very readable, approachable book goes through what you describe as four of the biggest threats to the integrity of our voting system, just as we are about to have people across the country casting votes in this important election year. You have written other books on our voting system in this country and threats to our voting system. What led you to want to explore issues relating to voter integrity and the threat to democracy, as you put it, in this new work of yours?
Well, I think that this is really the most important and urgent issue of our time. Back in 2008, I wrote a blog post for my election law blog where I commented, it was actually January 2009 when Barack Obama was being inaugurated, and I said, we shouldn't miss this moment. Here you have a conservative Republican handing power over to a liberal Democrat. It's a lot of pomp and circumstance. There's no question that we know who won the election and that we'll have a peaceful transition of power. And I think so much has deteriorated since that time, in the last decade or so, where now there's all kinds of reasons why trust in the voting process is declining. And we can't take for granted the idea that the losers are going to accept the election results as legitimate.
Well, and I'll add to that. I remember distinctly another very similar moment, which was John McCain's concession speech just a couple of months earlier, after he lost the election to Obama. And so clearly remember one of the most memorable lines from that speech where he said, Barack Obama is now my president. And
Right.
it just seems so far away from where we are today. And we'll talk about some of the direct hits to our voting system and to the trust that we depend on in that system. But on the point that you've raised, it's not just a fear that the era of peaceful transitions is at risk. But you tell the story of Nancy Pelosi's interview where she called into question whether if he loses his bid for re-election, will Donald Trump actually relinquish the reins of power? And not only did she say that, but his longtime confidant, lawyer, and fixer, Michael Cohen, made the same representation in his testimony to Congress. I mean, that's really saying
right.
something profound.
I think it is. Donald Trump is has uniquely challenged the fairness and integrity of the election process. But the problem goes well beyond Donald Trump. And in the book, I spin out scenarios where you can imagine Trump winning a second term and Democrats not accepting the results, believing, for example, that it's the result of voter suppression in Georgia or in Florida, or there's some kind of external threat to the election that causes everyone to wonder who the legitimate president is. I mean, so Trump is more of a symptom rather than the disease itself, but certainly we have to keep an eye on some of the things that he has said.
I think that is a fair point, that it is coming from both sides. In particular, the Democrats have proclaimed the losing candidate in the Georgia governor's race last time as the real governor of that state. And they've said that many times in different places. But this president, even going back to the time before he was elected, was using the power of his direct communication with the people. I'm talking about Twitter here, primarily, to really cast doubt on the integrity of our system. He complained that the election was rigged. This was even before he won that election. He stopped saying it was rigged after he won, but in almost every stump speech, that was a big part of the message. And of course, that's continued. Attacks on the media, so that people lose confidence in the integrity of the media. His propensity for lying, which causes a lot of people to lose faith in the word of our president. Even today, we're in the midst of the impeachment trial, and it seems like the primary defense being offered by the White House lawyers for President Trump is that impeachment is really an attempt to, well, first they were saying to upend the will of the people who elected Trump president in 2016, but now they're also saying this is an attempt to take away the power of the voters to decide whether he should be reelected in November of this year. I mean, every which way we look and hear and see what's going on, we're talking about profound existential threats to the bedrock of our entire democratic system.
Well, and you may remember that Adam Schiff, when he was giving his summation speech at the beginning of the Senate trial, said that maybe the president should be impeached because he cannot be trusted to not solicit further election interference in the 2020 election. So we really are so far away from where we were just a decade ago. And with even greater polarization among the populace, where you believe the other side is not just wrong, but evil, it's hard to find the middle ground. It's hard to find the grace that it sometimes takes in the event of a close election for someone to step aside for the good of that country.
Right. Well, and this is a similar conversation that we've had, many of us have had, on different issues of the day. But focusing on the issue of voting, there's this tendency to point the finger at the person of Donald Trump. And I know you make this point in the book, the problem that we're now talking about, how far we've come in the last decade from what is perhaps the most elegant feature of our democracy, that we can hand power. You know, when Washington handed power to Adams, that started something that I think had almost never been done in history. Power changed hands usually by force of one kind or another, not by peaceful transition from an election. The problem is greater than, I mean, he may exemplify it perfectly today and vividly, but the problem predates Trump, and I think, as you argue, will exist long after he's no longer president, whether or not he's reelected this year. So what are some of the currents in our politics, in our culture, in our society, do you think, that have eroded trust in our voting system?
So the book Election Meltdown talks about four main reasons why we've seen a decline in trust. And I've kind of danced around that, but let me just set them out here. First is the great voter fraud myth, the perpetuation of arguments that voter fraud is a major problem in the United States, mostly made by Republicans and usually offered as a way of justifying laws that make it harder for people to register or to vote. And although I do think there's been some exaggeration as to the extent to which, for example, voter ID laws influence the turnout or the outcome of elections, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these laws are not justified by any good empirical evidence that they either prevent a significant amount of voter fraud or promote voter confidence. And so these suppressive efforts manage to simultaneously convince Republicans that Democrats are trying to steal the election through fraud, and convince Democrats that Republicans are trying to suppress the vote of Democrats. I think, so it has this kind of double whammy effect.
Well, does one side have, before we move on to the second, does one side have a more credible case, do you think?
Well, I think that there is no question that these laws are intended to suppress the Democratic vote. They don't always do that. I give some examples where they do. So I talk about what I consider the most important voting rights trial of the 21st century so far in Kansas, where Kansas had passed a law requiring people to provide documentary proof of citizenship, like a naturalization certificate or a birth certificate, before they could register to vote. And we know that about 30,000 people had their voter registrations suspended because they hadn't been able to produce their papers. And that was in effect until a federal court issued a preliminary injunction requiring Kansas to accept those voter registration papers. So sometimes they do have the effect, but I think there's no question that the intent of these laws is to suppress the vote. And so I don't think there's equivalence there. There's equivalence in the sense that it's undermining the confidence of Democrats and Republicans, but it's asymmetrical. The claims that this is intended to suppress the vote, I think, are pretty clear. The claims that there's voter fraud are mostly unsupported.
Well, and the
where
type
there's
of vote,
disagreement is over how suppressive they are.
Yeah, well, right, but to go back to your point on the intent, because that should be pretty important. That is, any law, we know from constitutional law, any law that seeks to put any limitation on a constitutional right has to have a pretty sound and significant government interest. So if the underpinning, if the basis, the claim basis for any voter ID law, which would put a limit on our constitutional right to vote, is based on voter fraud, and there's absolutely no basis for that claim, that should be sufficient to undo those types of laws. And I think your work details in individual cases and looking at the problem overall, that there really is no case to be made for voter fraud. I mean, there's been a lot of claims, but there's no case there.
Right, and yet the Supreme Court in 2008, in a case called Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, said that just the potential for voter fraud is enough to sustain a voter ID law, even if its intent is partisan. and that what you have to do is show that particular voters face a special burden in being able to produce their IDs. So, I mean, there's been more litigation, but the Supreme Court in that 2008 case gave the green light to this evidentiary-free claim about voter fraud and public confidence. So I think that's troubling.
And we saw that play out in Pennsylvania, where I am. The voter ID law that passed here through a Republican legislature failed in court after a lengthy trial, and there was a lot of evidence that showed that whether you could prove a clear motive, a clear intention in this regard or not, certainly the impact of requiring citizens to produce documentation and ID to vote had a disparate impact on low-income and racial minority voters.
But I think what actually killed the voter ID law in Pennsylvania was the fact that the Bureau of Motor Vehicles there could not get its act together and actually produce the so-called free IDs that the state had promised for people who lacked them. And there were so many people, for example, people who live in Philadelphia who didn't have driver's licenses who would need to get the right form of ID. And, we've seen this around the country in Wisconsin, Texas, North Carolina, where the state puts the law into effect, and then one of the problems is they promise an education campaign, they promise, an easy way to get the ID, and then they don't deliver it. And then that turns out to be the problem. So there's been plenty of litigation on kind of the subsidiary questions of how these laws actually work on the ground.
Well, there's a pretty, I say an easy fix, but at least a pretty easy to understand fix that you talk about in the book, which is a national ID and any of a variety of ways to make access to the voting booth much, much easier. It could be a national holiday for voting. It could be online voting of some kind or another. They're just, why aren't we doing that? Why are we leaving it to the states and particularly in national elections where there is so much room for this type of problem to come about?
Well, I think there's a kind of path dependence here, which is that the United States has had 2 centuries plus of local election administration, and it's kind of a big turf war. Even when after the 2000 debacle in Florida between Bush and Gore, when Congress created something called the United States Election Assistance Commission to provide just advice to states as to how to run their elections, that was seen by secretaries of state as usurping their power to run elections. There's a lot of localism, there's a lot of parochialism in all of this. There's a lot of partisanship, obviously. In 2012, I wrote an earlier book called The Voting Wars, where I proposed national voter ID coupled with universal voter registration. And what I like to say is that this united Democrats and Republicans, because it united them against it. The Democrats hated the part that had the ID, and the Republicans hated the part about universal voter registration.
I see.
So it's really tough to move off that. This new book, Election Meltdown, is not asking kind of the long-term questions, which I think involve civics education and revamping our election system, but what can we do to prevent meltdown in 2020, which is a much more urgent question.
Okay. All right, so voters, so you identify 4 principal dangers. We'll keep the focus on 2020 then. One we've been talking about is voter suppression. Are there, before we move off that, are there fresh attacks that look to lead to the potential for voter suppression in this coming election year that you're concerned about?
Well, I think it's a constant battle. I talk about how there was this important trial in Kansas where voter fraud claims were really put on trial. Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State of Kansas, famous for making kind of incendiary claims about voter fraud, claimed that the evidence he had produced before was the tip of the iceberg. And the chief judge in Kansas, in the federal district court in Kansas, said there is no iceberg, there's just an icicle. There was also the Pence-Kobach Voter Fraud Commission, you may remember, that the president created to try and bolster his unsubstantiated claims of 3 million or more fraudulent votes cast for his opponent in 2016. Not coincidentally, the number of votes that he lost in the Electoral College, and that commission collapsed. So, kind of the claims of voter fraud collapse when they're put to any scrutiny, and yet new laws and new procedures are adopted all the time. Talk about a voter fraud, a voter purge in Texas, where the claim was that up to 58,000 non-citizens had voted in Texas elections, which would be astounding. And it turned out the whole thing was the result of bureaucratic incompetence or worse, where they were matching an old citizenship list to a current voter registration database. And Texas, during the relevant period, had 1 million people become citizens and became naturalized citizens during that period. But yet, still today, you can go to Twitter and look at the feed of the Attorney General of Texas claiming 58,000 non-citizens voting, and then that claim's out there. I think it's been liked 85,000 times. I mean, these things just perpetuate. You get new proposals all the time to try to make it harder for people to register and to vote on the basis of this phantom voter fraud.
What is the base? Because Texas isn't the only state that's seen some pretty significant voter purges. What is that, and what can be done about that? Because it does seem not only do these allegations that are not substantiated stick around and work their way into people's consciousness. Some might say that's the true fake news that we deal with every day now, but it becomes very real for those people who've been purged. Tens of thousands of people, and Texas isn't the only state. So, what do you see as something that can be done to address that this year, as an election is now upon us?
Well, so there is a federal law called the National Voter Registration Act. It's a 1993 law, sometimes referred to as the Motor Voter Law, and it provides protections against last-minute voter purges. Look, voter purges are necessary because people die and they move and they don't change their voter registration, and we don't have this national, single way of dealing with this situation. And so there's been a lot of improvement. States now participate, I think it's 27 states participate in sharing information through something called ERIC, which is an electronic database. I mean, there are things that can be done, but it sometimes requires litigation to make sure that the states are following the rules. Sometimes it requires litigation on the other side to make sure that states are cleaning their voting rolls, because even though we don't have dead people voting the way it's sometimes claimed, it's not good practice to have hundreds of thousands of people on the voting rolls who are no longer alive, right? So we need to have a sensible way of dealing with this problem.
Well, and I can see purging is such a nasty term. I mean, I can see updating voting rolls to take care of people who have passed away, but some states have pursued purges of voters who haven't voted in two preceding elections. That seems a much shakier basis for kicking someone off the voting rolls.
Well, yeah, so the Supreme Court decided a case in 2018 saying that Ohio could do that. And, it's kind of a weird constitutional right. It's not like you lose the right to bear arms if you don't shoot a gun, but yet you could lose the right to vote if you don't exercise it. But the problem is figuring out who's legit and who's not on the voting rolls. And so, that sometimes is a concern. And so we have to have kind of sensible ways of doing it. And there are lots of, fair-minded people who are trying to find the right way to deal with these problems. And if we had a little bit less partisanship and a little bit less polarization, I think we might be able to get more accomplished.
Is this a partisan issue? In other words, are there any examples from your research where a Democrat-led state legislature or elections commission has purged tens of thousands of voters?
There are. We're cleaning voting rolls all the time. It's just not necessarily called a purge. So that kind of stuff does happen. But, let's not make Democrats sound like they're, only acting in the public interest. So when a state makes it much easier for people to register and vote, as, for example, California has done with automatic voter registration through the DMV, the idea is that those people who are least likely to register and vote are likely to vote for Democrats. And so you may have all kinds of partisan reasons why you want to expand the electorate, just like why you might want to contract it. Mm-hmm. So, we have to look at everything that's being done with a kind of jaundiced eye, recognizing that these things are being done in a way to, favor the party in power that is administering the election.
Well, and it's too much of a side street for our conversation here, but there's no question that both Democratic-led state legislatures and Republican-led state legislatures have engaged in gerrymandering, and that's another way of, trying to pursue your own political partisan interests. But okay, so voter suppression is one of the principal dangers you identify, and then you next talk about pockets of electoral incompetence. What do you mean there?
So I'd say most election administrators do a pretty good job running elections, given the limited resources and the fact that it's really hard to. I mean, elections, aside from like going to war or taking the census, hard to think of a kind of national thing on a timeline that we all have to do as a country. So it's hard, and most places they do a good job, but when an election is really close, the focus tends to be on the weakest links, those who are not running the election competently, and those who have the greatest ability to mess things up. And I give examples of bad election administration on the Democratic and Republican side. I think Democratic poor administration gets more attention because Democrats tend to live in big cities where there are more votes, and sometimes when Democratic election administrators do a very poor job, they're accused of intentionally trying to manipulate the outcome of the election. The example I give is Broward County, Florida. Brenda Snipes, you may remember her. President Trump attacked her in 2018. This was the close U.S. Senate election between Bill Nelson, the incumbent Democrat, and Rick Scott, the then governor who was running. And it was just a series of ridiculous mistakes in how she ran her election. For example, the election was so close they had to do a recount using machines, and they were 2 minutes late in submitting their vote totals to the state because they didn't know how to operate the website to submit their vote totals to the state. So those totals didn't count in the election process. Brenda Snipes refused to tell the Scott campaign how many outstanding votes were still left to be counted. In earlier elections, in one election, she left an initiative off the ballot. In another election, she failed to mail 58,000 absentee ballots to people who requested them. So time after time, she showed her incompetence, and yet she remained in office for many years because it was an elected partisan position. She was a Democrat. She was consistently reelected without much opposition. When an election is really close, when you put it under the microscope, people are going to focus on this really poor election administration in these pockets, and I think that can really undermine people's confidence in the process and thinking either they can't figure out how to count the votes or something even worse is going on.
So is one answer to that then nonpartisan election administration, or at least bipartisan election administration?
I certainly think those would be better than partisan election administration. But again, that's more of a long-term solution. I think we need to be doing triage, and we need to be making sure that states are bolstering poll worker training and bolstering, cybersecurity, the kinds of things that really can mess things up in 2020. We need to ask the triage question: what can a state do to assure that these weak places do not have problems again? And one example I give is Detroit, where you may remember Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate in 2016, requested recounts in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, those close races, 2016. And they couldn't even complete the recount in Michigan because so many precincts in Detroit, the numbers that were reported didn't match total numbers of ballots reported as counted didn't match the number of ballots that were recorded as having been received. And so there was a whole investigation. There were claims of fraud, and it just turned out poll worker incompetence. They did not know how to feed the ballots into the ballot counting machine. It's just like really kind of, Keystone Cops type problems. And so, I've asked the Secretary of State of Michigan if they're doing more, and she says they are, but hopefully it's going to be enough.
You mentioned cybersecurity, and so much of our focus has been on Russian hacking, and I guess if you're a conspiracy theorist, Ukraine hacking. But one of the things we know for sure that's happened is how state governments have seen their computers hacked. Entire sections of state or municipal governments have been shut down. We had our court system here in Philadelphia shut down by a hack. It took couple of months for it to get back up and running. Baltimore, Atlanta, other places too. I would think that those would be pretty vulnerable, given that a lot of states perhaps haven't directed the necessary resources to make sure they have the latest and best protections from cybersecurity. And seeing what happens in cases like the Brenda Snipes case or the story you told about Detroit, are you worried that could be a way that, whether it's domestic or foreign, there could be some real disruption coming if people don't make the right investment in that type of protection?
Well, so that brings me to the third of the four concerns I have, which is dirty tricks. And, we saw them in 2016. One of the things we saw, what gets the most attention about what the Russians did was the leaking of the DNC emails and the social media manipulation. But the other thing that they did was they probed and in a few instances tried to alter information in state voter registration databases. They were sniffing around. They did some things that indicated that there were these vulnerabilities. And so we're now seeing extensive election cybersecurity initiatives to try to make sure that voter registration databases and other related websites are being protected. In the book, I spell out another nightmare scenario based on some of the things that the Russians did in Ukraine beginning in 2015, which is, what if we had an attack on the power grid in the city of Detroit or the city of Milwaukee? Pick a swing state, attack the Democratic city in the swing state, and try and swing the results of the election. And not only are we potentially vulnerable to such an attack, we have a president who's not been out there saying, do not do this. This would be considered an act of war. And we don't have good laws in place for dealing with either a terrorist attack or national emergency on election day in a presidential election. We've been calling for this for years, that states need to, and Congress needs to come up with contingency plans if there is an election day attack, and we don't have it. And, for the courts to have to invent that on the fly, you're going to have a lot of concerns about, I'd say, subconscious partisanship coming into the process in terms of, just like in Bush versus Gore, when you think about what's fair, it's hard to be detached from what you think about what the results of the election should be.
Well, right. I mean, we're still living maybe in the 19th, if not the 20th century when it comes to that, because when you think about dirty tricks, causing some type of disruption, I mean, the classic image is somebody intimidating voters at a single voting booth or polling location, or maybe a few. But the idea that, again, it could be domestic, it could be foreign based, that an entire city's or an entire state's election system could be shut down on election day. And what would we do? I mean, that threat wasn't even imaginable 10 years ago. And now it seems like we see examples of this all the time.
Right. So I do think it does raise some serious questions about whether we are prepared. And, you're always fighting the last war. We may be better prepared for what happened in 2016, but of course now we have to fight what's going on in 2020.
Okay. And the fourth principal danger you talk about in the book, Rick, in terms of this year's election, is the rising intensity level, the incendiary rhetoric, as you put it, regarding so-called stolen or rigged elections. I think we started out, or maybe I introed the whole topic with that idea, but how that seems so particularly worrisome and so hard to address, because at least with cybersecurity, you can say I can throw money, I can throw resources, I can throw technology at this problem, and I can reduce that risk. But what do you do about the rhetoric that we're seeing more and more? We're seeing it play out during this impeachment trial, as we were saying earlier.
Yeah, so I do think that it is troubling when people talk about stolen or rigged elections without good justification. I mean, you could have a stolen or rigged election. I give an example in the book of the 9th congressional district race in North Carolina, where there was ballot tampering. So it does happen occasionally, and there it is, I think, appropriate to say, this election was not done fairly. It needs to be redone. But when you have the president claiming that the election is rigged, or as you mentioned earlier, you have Stacey Abrams supporters saying her election was stolen. I think you have to be very careful with that rhetoric because it can be demobilizing and it can undermine people's confidence. If my guy won, I'm sure the election was fair. If the other guy won, I'm sure it was manipulated. That really undermines the very basis of our democracy, which is that we accept the election results when we are on the losing side, and we just agree to fight another day. So I think this is a serious question that we need to think about. How do we talk about elections? And there, the longer-term solution is civics education about the importance of a process by which people understand how presidential transitions and elections take place. But in the short term, I think, we've got to call it out when we see it. We've got to call out this kind of rhetoric when it is done by either people we disagree with or people we like. And I like Stacey Abrams a lot, and I can't tell you the kind of vitriol I got, including from celebrities like Alex Baldwin attacking me on Twitter for coming out and saying that we shouldn't call that election stolen. And so I think there's this real indignance about the how dare you challenge what I think about what's fair about elections, and if I want to call an election stolen, I should be able to do that. So that's kind of the long answer to say that we need to tone it down, except when it's justified. And trying to explain that to people in the heat of a close election is very, very tough.
Well, right, and as people are now getting serious, and in some states, as I said earlier, getting ready actually to cast votes, having pointed out these imminent dangers or potential dangers to the integrity of the vote, how I'm wondering, sure, if you can point to that congressional race in North Carolina that really was there was a lot of fraud in that case, and some of these other issues that you can talk in sort of quantitative ways, whether it's voter purges or even the examples you gave from Broward County and from Detroit, where you can talk about a number of votes and what impact that had and how that had to be corrected. Some of these other things we're talking about seem to me much more difficult to quantify. And I imagine that one of the great concerns is that when people lose faith, and that's really what you're getting at, is more than just the risk that a particular election itself will be corrupted, but the loss of faith in the system itself. I imagine that one of the great dangers there is that people become even more disengaged with the process. Right. I mean, my daughter, one of my daughters is in New Hampshire right now. I was up visiting her this weekend, canvassing to get people out to vote in the upcoming New Hampshire primary next month. And the number of people she runs into who are in their 30s or in their 40s and have never voted is pretty astonishing. So I imagine it's very difficult to quantify or to measure this, but what impact do you think it does have? The stories about incompetence, the dirty tricks, the rhetoric, the false claims of voter fraud. What impact do you think that has on the vote?
So I think we don't know exactly what affects turnout. It's so hard to say, whether particular things affect turnout. We do know that people's trust in government institutions is down, but also trust in the election process is down. There was a recent NPR poll showing 4 in 10 people thought that there would be foreign interference in our election. 62%, I think, said that they were concerned that the election was not going to be run in a fair way. I mean, there's a kind of corrosive effect of all of this, and it's really hard to know the specifics of what it's doing in terms of demobilizing people. But it's certainly causing people to be cynical and causing those who are hardcore partisans to have further mistrust in the other side. And when you've got such a polarized time, it's hard to see that this is the time to do election reform and try and fix things. But of course, now is when it is most urgently needed. So I think it's got a little bit of a catch-22 when it comes to those kinds of issues.
Well, Rick, let me finish with this, because after going through each of these different areas of or types of threat to our election system, throughout your discussion, you do imagine the nightmare situation. We alluded to this earlier. That is, that either Trump loses re-election and claims some kind of election fraud leading to his loss, or he wins re-election and the Democrats claim some type of voter fraud that allowed him to be reelected. That would be pretty serious in the history of our country. I mean, a lot of people were unhappy the day Trump was elected, but I don't think anybody could really credibly say then in 2016 that he was illegitimately elected. But there are many who worry now, and you imagine this worry playing out, that the day after Election Day this year in November, there could be large numbers of people in this country who don't believe in the result of the election for some reason. What do we do in that case?
Well, so, the best protection against this is something which is out of our control, which is not having a close election, which is precisely the point that Nancy Pelosi made in that interview in 2018 that you referred to at the top of our discussion, which was, she said, if Democrats win the House by just 3 or 4 seats in a squeaker, Trump's not going to accept it, and the only way is to have a massive win. Right? So, but of course, if there's concerns on both sides, then a massive win is, still not going to convince some people who are on the losing side. But the bigger the margin, the easier it's going to be. But we've had squeakers of elections. You look at some of the polling in places like Wisconsin, it looks like we could have a squeaker of an election again. And so, I talk about the lack of good short-term solutions because we depend on the courts. Well, the courts are more polarized now, too. Is the United States Supreme Court, if it resolves a close election towards Trump on a 5-4 vote, with Gorsuch being one of the votes that should have been Merrick Garland's, according to Democrats, are they going to accept that? Can we trot out the elders like Colin Powell or Madeleine Albright to tell people, to accept election results? That might have worked 10 or 15 years ago. Hard to see in this Trumpian era that works now. People may take to the streets, which of course is not what you generally want to see as how elections are resolved. But it might take public pressure in the event of a close election. So I'm very worried about 2020, and the purpose of this book is to try to sound the alarm. I can say that I'm alarmed enough that I put together a conference that asks the question, can American democracy survive the 2020 elections? And our goal in this conference is going to be to produce some recommendations by early May for what media, law, tech, and people in the political world need to be doing to try to minimize the chances of an election meltdown in 2020.
Well, Rick, you've sounded the alarm, and I have to say I was hoping with this conversation that I would feel less alarmed, but I think I feel more alarmed. I'm nervous. This conference that you mentioned, if people listening want to check back and see what those recommendations are, is there a website? Is there a link that we can include in the description for this episode, or is that something you can send me once it's available so that people can follow up and stay close to this issue?
So the conference will be at the University of California, Irvine, which is where I teach. And it's going to be on the conference itself will be on February 28th, and it's going to be webcast live. And then the results of that, and so you can go to law.uci.edu/election2020, and you can get information about this conference. And then I hope by early May we will be releasing the report with recommendations.
Very good. Well, Rick Hasen, Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. Excuse me. We'll put that link that you just gave us in the description so people can log into the webcast and stay tuned for additional information coming out of that conference. Thank you so much. Thank you for the book, Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. I read it over the weekend and enjoy it and recommend it to everyone. We'll also put a link to the book so people can can get a copy of it. It's really, it's only, 130 something pages, something like that. Very readable and really lays out in detail, very compellingly, everything that we've been talking about here today on the program. So thank you so much, Rick, for being on Good Law, Bad Law. I appreciate it.
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I would just direct your readers to one more site, which is electionmeltdown.com, which has information on my book tour, because I'll be going around the country talking about this in a bunch of different venues.
Excellent. Well, I encourage people to look for you in person, and we're happy that you were able to join us. We'll have the episode up shortly, and encourage everybody to listen. Thanks so much, Rick Hasen from University of California. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you. Take care.